Hello everyone. Welcome to the last video about Dutch politics. This time we're going to talk about other left-wing parties that we haven't discussed so far. So, like the previous video on other right-wing parties, we're just going to go over these left-wing parties, talk about a couple of things of note, how you might want to use them in debates, and just give you some general ideas of how this works in the Netherlands, but also examples that you can use for motions about generic politics. So this might be, should these small parties exist in the first place? Are they doing good? Are they doing harm? All of that kind of stuff. So let's talk about which parties I'm going to talk about. Firstly, we'll talk about the Socialist Party, the SP, talk about DENK, Volt, European Party, Party of the Animal, or Partij van Dieren in Dutch, and lastly, the ChristenUnie, or the Unions of Christians. So let's just talk about which parties we're actually talking about in the context of size. Again, this is a chart which shows you the amount of seats that parties have gotten in the 2023 election. So that was the previous government and the current election. So the 2025, and therefore the current government and the current second chamber. And the parties we're going to be talking about are just going to be less big, as we can see already here from the main parties that we've discussed, and then an individual deep dive about. And if you also see them, they are also smaller than some of the smaller right-wing parties that we've discussed. So this is the, Animal Party, Christian Union, DENK, Socialist Party, and Volt. They have like 3 seats max and 1 seat, minimum. And this kind of shows you just the context of the Netherlands about what we're leaning towards, and that is that we tend to be a right-leaning country, which might sound weird if you look at it from the outside, because the Netherlands is maybe known for having quite some left-leaning policies, right? So we have pretty good university, we have a lot of spending, we have a healthcare system which is not like the US, which is expensive. We have a lot of things that are a bit more left-leaning, like not necessarily as have an expensive of a welfare state as you might expect from Scandinavian countries. But we are quite left-leaning from that perception, especially from people from outside Europe. But then if you look at what we actually are policy-wise and politics-wise in the context of our country, we are more right-leaning than left-leaning. And it also shows you that the smaller left-leaning parties have less relative power than the small leaning right parties, just by the sheer number of seats that the smaller right-wing parties have. So let's then talk about the first party. So the Socialist Party is basically just the socialist party as you would expect them to be. So they're quite left-leaning. They want to put higher taxes. They want to have reform that means that big companies are going to pay more for taxes, that rich people are going to pay more taxes, they're going to be more capital taxes, that kind of stuff. They try to make everything as fair as possible. So they want to put more money in like healthcare, in education, in public transport, all of these kinds of things. They're in favor of like nationalization or having the government in do their projects and that kind of stuff rather than leaving it to the free market. And it's just what the Socialist Party is going for. Interestingly, there's been a divide between the national party that you have here and the youth party. So you had the Socialist Party, the youth party, um, and basically, how that would normally work is you have your own youth congresses. They have their own things that they want to push for, and they might, for example, do campaigning and awareness and all that kind of stuff. And it's a way for younger people to still be able to politically engage and try to be, convinced that they should join a party when they are of age and when they can vote. And that's kind of like the whole concept of this youth party system. And what happened is that the Socialist Party is quite left-leaning, but it's oftentimes interestingly he has quite some older voters, and there has been now a youth party which was even more left-leaning, so left-leaning to the point that the National Party was basically distancing itself from this new like uh, youth party. And what kind of happened was that party got independent and they become even more left-leaning. So they become more radical. They want to have more changes. They want to stand for even larger projects and all this kind of stuff. Which also means that if you look at, for example, the level of municipality and like provincial levels, there are now also new kind of like socialist or revolutionary parties that are popping up that are basically there because the youth fraction got disenfranchised or got disillusioned with the main socialist party because it wasn't left leaning enough, and then they started their own thing. And I think this kind of shows you an interesting thing about the Netherlands, where it's like the infighting, which is the Socialist Party, if you now look at who's voting for it in municipal levels, but also in the party, it is just the older generation, which might not be what you expect because you would expect maybe more of like the younger kids, the kind of like socialist latte drinking university students who might vote socialist parties. They do exist, but there does show that there's like a disagreement here on how far left they should go, and that kind of stuff. And the Socialist Party has basically been an opposition party for a very long time. So it actually hasn't been part of any coalition, mainly as you have hopefully now understood from the many videos that we've already done about Dutch politics, that the Netherlands is relatively right wing in its coalitions, and the Socialist Party would be way too left leaning to be able to be considered in any form of coalition. They have been, however, quite important in pushing specific issues to the front. So this might be, for example, in Groningen, we had gas that we basically pumped out. And as a consequence of the gas being pumped out, the structure of the ground became less solid because we're just changing a lot, we're pumping out gas. And as a consequence of that, we got earthquakes. Earthquakes in the Netherlands, they were like bad and they were creating like, houses collapsing and all that kind of stuff. But it isn't necessarily that the Netherlands is a more like prone area where the earthquakes are going to get worse, but it is rather the Netherlands as a nation is not very used to having earthquakes in general. Because again, we have been fighting water for a long time, so we built a lot of dams, we've built off like water infrastructure so that there's way for water to flood away and for us to pump out land from the sea. That's how we got a lot large parts of our provinces or parts from Holland by pumping out this water. So we like this idea of control. I feel like we need to have control about the environment. And here, when this then happens, where we don't have control and we're unable to, again, isolate ourselves by making dams or anything like that, it kind of becomes a very big issue. And people who felt like there need to be more retributions towards people in Groningen who had their houses being destroyed, the Socialist Party was one of the opposition parties who going hard for that. And same thing with the child benefit affair. I'm not going to go into detail about child benefit affair. Again, there was a video about this, about the last election, that already explains this into more detail. But basically, it was just one of those cases where there were people who were flagged in the Dutch tax system as being fraudsters and getting money from the state that they shouldn't. And then there was a lot of like prosecution there, and there were also issues with like, specific groups of people, like ethnic minorities being specifically targeted by these systems. And therefore, not only did the money get taken away, but they got accused of fraud. So there were more potential punishment that they could have gotten. And then to show live this, the Socialist Party was a big part in actually getting this forward. So the Socialist Party shows you that there's a interesting part for opposition party where they're able to bring things to light and actually get effective change. Because of the continuous like hearing about this and the continuous like asking questions in parliament, they were able to get this to the light and get this into the attention of the average voter, which is why it became a big issue in elections and something that people now know about. I think the government should do something about. So I think this is, for example, a very clear example why it might be good to have these small parties in the first place. Then some other interesting things of characterizing the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party ironically, is the richest party in the Netherlands. And the way that they do it is because they basically say to everyone, okay, you have a certain amount of money that you get from the state. We're going to take that. We're going to pay you just like a minimum or like a reasonable wage, which is something like 3K euros. And everything else you're just going to give towards the Socialist Party. And that way we're going to buy, for example, like the houses that we're going to own, that we're going to have like our conferences in. We're going to centralize that and all that kind of stuff. And I think this is interesting because if you look at the Socialist Party, the things that they do aren't just outreach and campaigning and like opposition, that kind of stuff. But in the local level, they also have different campaigns where they actively spend that money to help people in need, even if it doesn't, you know, even if it doesn't necessarily lead to election. Like it isn't for an election cycle. It's something that they structure to do. Partially, you could say this is because they just want voters. Or you could also say this is just generally people wanting to make a better world. And if they see poor people struggling, if they can't do it via the opposition, they'll use their own means to get this. So what does this actually look like? This looks like for families who are quite poor, placing in these areas specifically boxes in which there is, for example, free menstruation products, so that women will always be able to access that in the first place, or organizing free extra curricular help for people who are struggling and all that kind of stuff, or organizing like free handouts for people who are poor on the streets and that kind of stuff. And I think this kind of shows another interesting, um, an interesting like development or an interesting aspect of political parties is that sometimes you can look at them from a realpolitik lens. And what I mean with this is you just look at the incentives of how do we get the most voters, how do we get the most things, like how do we get the most of our policy through, and that kind of stuff. And there are definitely parties and people who are in political parties that look at it this way, but there are also people who just generally are convinced about trying to do the right thing, and they will use resources even if it's not maybe the most efficient in the way of getting people to elected because they want to do something good. And I think here, just this example of the Socialist Party do show that there's also other things that parties can do outside of campaigning and getting things to the forefront that's actually good for people on the ground, right? So you might think of socialism, whatever you want, but giving menstruation products for people who are poor and can't afford them quite intuitively is a good thing. And I think this is examples that you could draw from on the side. So that's basically just the Socialist Party hasn't been really effective, but has been doing interesting things in the opposition and just in general. Okay, Denk. Denk is quite interesting because basically it started as a separation from basically the Labour Party, and they are focusing a lot on minorities, and specifically Moroccan minorities, but also Turkish minorities that have in the Netherlands. So again, some context. In the Netherlands, around the 60s, we had the issue where we had factories and we needed laborers for them, and we also had like dirty jobs that basically the Dutch population did not want to do. And they basically got a lot of people from other regions, so like Turkey, Morocco, Poland, and all that kind of stuff to come to the Netherlands and work there. And the idea always was they'll stay here for just a couple of years and then they'll go back. So we didn't do any assimilation for them. We didn't give them any like language courses or any requirements because the idea was just you're going to move back. Then basically what happened is they brought their families, they stayed here, and this led to kind of like a quite big diaspora of people who are from different nations try in the Netherlands who have been marginalized in various ways, right? So they're in jobs that aren't already well paid. They're doing jobs that aren't necessarily very thankful or aren't necessarily looked upon in a good light. Besides that, they have issues with kind of like assimilating because they're not learning the language. And also, they oftentimes are isolated because they're getting into areas, of course, where people speak the language. So you oftentimes get like regions where they speak that specific language, it's kind of like isolated. Which leads to also cultural divides within, for example, cities, where now there are people that don't speak the language that have weird cultural norms to you that might, for example, honk the horn too much when their like original country wins a game in the World Cup. And that leads to kind of like of course, breeds into discrimination and all that kind of stuff. So that kind of like the context of the Netherlands still bleeds through to today. Because even though that happened a long time ago, still there are people who feel who are marginalized, who still, for example, don't have good time integrating, who still find, for example, that this is not going well. And interestingly, sometimes even if the first generation wants to assimilate and feels like they're very thankful to the Netherlands or whatever for the job and the opportunity they got, the second generation doesn't often have the same perception because they don't, for example, experience much of the hardships that they had from the past, but do experience things like the discrimination, the being different, and all that kind of stuff. And this leads to a discrepancy, which also means that the people in the second generation feel like there's no one listening to them, and have legitimate issues that you're not being listened to, and there might be over policed, and there might be stereotypes within work, all that kind of stuff, which means that they are actually kind of like yearning be a bit back for these other original countries or the original culture compared to the Dutch culture because they don't feel as that representative. Now, that being said, Denk is basically a party that tries to give these interests towards people. So, for example, they want to help people from this migration backgrounds to protect them. This also means that, for example, they're left leaning, so they have some general left leaning policy that they want to go for, such as spending more money for education, helping these people with integration, sometimes also putting pushback when, for example, you have vaccinations programs and you have like flyers explaining this stuff, that they also want to make sure that there is versions of that for people who are low lettered or like don't know that well, so they can also understand what's on there. These are kind of like things that they're going for. Now, this sounds quite fluffy and this sounds quite nice, but I think what makes Denk specifically controversial are a couple of things. One is that they are not very critical of Turkey and Morocco as a consequence, even if there might be things that they could be critical of, which is what they've been called out for, that they don't want to stand against bad things that have happened or have been, other parts have been critical and they've kind of like denying what's been happening. And those are things that they've been pushed back from. Also, some right-wing parties have been kind of like using this and kind of like, the PVV and kind of like pushing against Denk on this, that they aren't doing this enough and making this also a bit of like a theater show. But there is some genuine criticism that you can have here as well. It isn't just played up. And the second thing as well is how they got into power. So when they were split up and they were a new party, they faced the same issue that many parties do when they are starting off. You need to grab the attention of people. So what they did is they had online campaigns in which they were calling out and harassing people from labor who were, for example, from a Moroccan background and portraying them as traitors. This was really effective in getting people kind of like riled up And it's kind of like, again, a bit of a rage bait tactic where people that generally are upset at politics or at labor feel like now someone's actually listening to them. But also, it's one of those things where labor, of course, has to respond to this and media has to pick up on this happening. So you basically get a lot of attention that normally you would get. You now would get invited to talk shows to talk about why you are doing these things, which allows you now to suddenly platform your ideas, where originally, if you didn't do it, you wouldn't have been asked for this TV show. So this kind of controversial paths have led to a lot of like scrutiny and pushback against this because they are now not as cooperative. They are been doing things that are, you could say, immoral or bad or have bad influences on our politicians and that kind of stuff. I'm not going to go into the detail about the connections that they might have with Turkey and like the other issues that have been popping up with Denk, partially because they're a relatively small party. They haven't been in a coalition. They're unlikely to form a coalition because there hasn't been a left-leaning coalition for a very long time. You need to have the center there. And I don't think they want to work with Denk and that kind of stuff. But if you are interested, there's stuff online that you could look up into. Now, Volt. Volt is just a pro-European party, which just means that they are just that pro-European. So they try to cater specifically to young people who are highly educated, who are oftentimes already more in favor of the EU. This might be because of Erasmus projects. This might be with them knowing and understanding more what the EU is doing, or having more exposure to explanations of what the EU is actually doing, and have a better grasp of policy that the EU has implemented might be positive. So that's the kind of people that they normally go for. And it is oftentimes EU integration. So if there is a problem with asylum seekers, we need to do it via the EU. If we want to have, for example, more money to education, that's also good. But we also want to have more interaction with universities and information sharing within the EU. So it's just a lot of generic, just left-wing policy, and then just add the EU, and that's just the full flavor that you get. Again, they have been, I don't want to say recent because there are more recent parts we've discussed, but they have been in Dutch politics for a long time. They are small and they haven't really been able to do much oppositioning. They haven't been very important in coalition forming. So this is again one of those parties where there is a genuine question: would we really need it? Like, is this actually adding something to our politics? You could say maybe yes. You could maybe say no. But I think these are the examples that you might be draw to ask yourself, what is the use of this? Would have maybe been better if this would have been a fraction within the Labour, Green Left, or Progressive Netherlands, or however you want to call the new party now. Um, and does this maybe lead to too much fracturing on this side? So the next one is Party of the Animals, or Partij voor de Dieren in Dutch. I think they're quite interesting because they're just mainly concerned about animal welfare, but also it's just more ecological. So they're a bit more radical, they're a bit more, even more left leaning. They really want to make sure that we really care about animals. They're also incredibly pro Palestine, to the point where there has been discussions inside of the party where there's a disagreement on like how pro-Palestine they needed to be and if it was going too far, which led to a split and actually members leaving because it went too far pro-Palestine. And that was a fraction that was happening within the first chamber, not the second chamber, which is why there isn't a picture here of them. But basically that has led to this disagreement within the party. And this also is just a party that has been focusing on animal welfare. And again, it's one of those things where they have been trying to push on opposition. And to the credit, you could say that other parties now all have a piece in their election campaign about animal welfare that they didn't have before the animal party came to be in the first place. So you could say that's a change. However, given that the Netherlands is still, I think, per meter, like one of the most dense places for animals, and we still, for like animals, I mean like cows, livestock, pigs, all that kind of stuff. And we still are massively exporting them and doing like, a very big export of that. I would still put them in very small spaces. And there are a lot of ecological benefits, like ecological harms that happen as a consequence with methane being coming out from these animals and them using a lot of water to be fed and all that kind of stuff. It hasn't really shown a lot of like structural change. But the claims that they might be able to make is like smaller. So things like there's overall more animal welfare. There's been overall more better treatment. There have been more alternatives. They've been trying to find, for example, vegan foods, and investment in or maybe alternative industries. But again, it has been super, super major to the point where you could point to specific things to say, this is what the animal party has been able to get. It's just people who really care about nature and about animals and feels like green left used to not be far enough. or even now like the new Progressive Netherlands Party, which consists of Green Left and the Labour Party when they merge together, is also not going far enough. They are the ones that vote for the Animal Party, and this is kind of like what they are known for. So this is often also young people, women, oftentimes, and then also somewhat highly educated who are voting for these parties. That is basically just the characterization of the Animal Party. Now, lastly, the Christian Union. I think this is the most interesting party to talk about because of the fact that this is a party who actually has been part of coalitions, even if it hasn't had the most amount of votes. So sometimes you can be a small party and get into the coalition, even if you have like three, five, or three seats. And this is something where you can still put in control. And the Christian Union, as it shows here, is kind of like left leaning and center, but it's mostly about Christian values. And what this means is that their oftentimes are somewhat flexible on the economic policy. So like, yes, maybe they want still some more spending towards healthcare and all this kind of stuff. But most of the things that they really focus on are things that have to do with kind of like moral stances. So for example, not wanting to expand euthanasia because they already feel like this is something that you maybe shouldn't do, like shouldn't take it in human hands. And it's kind of like up to God to decide, as well as like some moral qualms where they feel like there might be pressures where people feel like they have to, you know, commit euthanasia because of economic reasons or because of other reasons where it might actually be fairer or better for them to not have the pressure of the choice and therefore be alive. So that'd be one example here. Or maybe like education, how much freedom should we get there to religious schools, all of that kind of stuff. And it's one of those things where and this also sometimes looks like with refugees, for example, having limits on how much harm you can do against them and some base needs that are required and that kind of stuff. So kind of like a moral aspect of the policy. And this has meant that they are able to make these changes and push these things through and represent therefore a religious minority that exists in the Netherlands or just a religious group that exists in the Netherlands while still being able to get policy through. So, for example, expansion of euthanasia haven't happened partially because when it was proposed by D66, the Christian Union was in a coalition with them, and as a consequence, they couldn't push through it because they need their support to be able to get a majority, and therefore the Christian Union was able to block that, which then represented a large group of people. And I think this is an example of just a part that's small, but is still able to get things done and is going to be important within politics. And that's, I think, the last party that I want to talk about. So I've been talking a lot about these parties and giving you context about it. But I hope that from this and the past videos, you've been able to do a couple of things. One, you can kind of like understand and characterize why specific parties might cater to a specific group. So, for example, the Green Left Labour already has quite some competition on the left and front from, for example, the Socialist Party and from the Animal Party, which means that the kind of like more radical idealists who don't want to go into coalition and really have like opposition culture are most likely going to go for those parties. Therefore, they're much more likely to want to go to the center because especially there you also have D66 and you want to go up those people. But that means that you might piss off people who are, again, green left, who are now characterized as maybe more active, like activistic and more caring about environment than maybe some labor policies. So they might shift now to the Animal Party. And then you can characterize why is this likely or why is this unlikely? Who are the kind of people who would want to vote for one party over the other party? What does the other party stand for? What is their history? How is their perception in the Netherlands? Do they think it's just basically just only options they can push through? Do they think that's good enough? Do they think that's actually good enough for them to vote for them? All of those things you can answer when you understand these parties and understand who votes for them and what the interests are of the party. And I think that's one part of it. And I think then secondly as well, I think there are a lot of interesting motions and a lot of interesting concepts that you can have around policies on what a party should and should not be allowed. So for example, should a party be fully internally democratic? And then you could ask yourself, well, you have the PVV, very interesting example because it just is a dictatorship. There isn't any party members. But you can also take something like the VVD and should we work with, for example, the PVV? This came kind of like from a league top down. Would it have been the same if you had more control, the people on the ground had more to say? Same thing with the Animal Party. They had a disagreement on how far they should go for Palestine. Would it be likely if you have more completely internally democratic policies for them to maybe agree, or will it lead actually to more splitting and more likely that the party is going to fall apart, which might not be good for a variety of reasons? Those are the kind of questions that you can ask yourself. when you understand these concepts more and you understand what's the going on of this party. And this is not just about internal democratic policies. Other motions can be about um, whether these small parties are adding more stuff to society than taking away, if they make policies overall worse, whether we should allow them to split off or not, whether we should allow them to be in the parliament if they only have, like, I don't know, a couple of seats. All of these things are things you can really understand and grasp now in the Netherlands because these are relevant topics, right? That there are genuine trades you can have here. If you implement a voter threshold, which means you only get into parliament when you have a specific number of seats, certain parties will just not go through. Socialist Party, and most likely the Animal Party, and Volt, and Dank would not go through. What would happen then to the Dutch left if the only option is basically Green Left Labour and D66 and maybe Christian Union? Like, what would happen there? Would it become more radical? Would it become more disenfranchised? Would they become disillusioned, not vote? All of that kind of stuff. The real, like, you can think of generic reasons why they would do it, but really understanding and grasping who the people are and what the parties stand for and what they've been able to achieve or not achieve shows you what actually can happen. And just besides it just becoming a debate within debate land in which you just give generic mechanisms, you can now use empirical evidence and actual context to talk about this. And lastly, I think it's also just understanding politics a bit better. Because sometimes, right, when you go to debating, it's just good to sometimes just have these illustrations of how this can work in the system. And once you understand how this can work in the system and you understand the nuances of it, you can oftentimes apply that to other systems as well. So I want to end on a last note on this, on like the party power and that kind of stuff, because it's something that I didn't touch upon before, but I think is a quite interesting point to understand more nuancely how lobbying works. So in debating, we get things like lobbying because companies give money. They give money because that means you get more money for campaign elections. This is necessary because if you don't get voted in, then guess what? You're not going to get in, and that's what your primary need, and you want to get policy through. And you feel like if you're not going to do it, someone else might get that money, and it's better you in the party because you in parliament because at least you can get some of your ideas through. Right? That's the very bare bone idea of this is how much. This is how you get lobbying. Other parts are often more nuanced, right? So these are, for example, backdoor discussions in which you have banks and like big companies talk to politicians and explain to them why policy might be good. And I think here, there's already a bit more nuance because now it's also generally convincing people, right? And instead of this becoming just like a real politic thing of like, if you get money, all this kind of stuff, it becomes more looking at politicians as individuals. And when you have people who are smart, who are explaining to you, we found from this research, it might actually improve economic productivity. If we deregulate the sector by this much, you would get this much in taxes, all that kind of stuff. It becomes more reasonable to actually buy in from what these companies say. And I think specifically for small parties, this is something that is actually important. So an example here is the farmers movement, so the BBB or the Farmers Party, basically got a lot of not just money from like the meat industry, but what the meat industry is they would give propositions for proposals directly towards the Farmers Party. And you might say, this is undemocratic, unfair, all that kind of stuff. But if you look at it from the Farmers Party, they are meant to represent the people who are disillusioned with the current political system because of too strict climate regulation. So these are farmers, these are people in the meat industry, and also people like, killing the animals to then make it meat of it, like the butcher houses, that kind of stuff. For them, it is very rational to say, like, these are the sectors that we are protecting because these are the ones that would have to give in the most if we are going to really apply to climate regulations and if we need to cut our livestock and all kind of fun because they're just the biggest polluters and they take and use the most things that we need. This then means that for them, it is completely rational to listen to this because it's part of their constituents. But also, it is just very, very nice if a big company comes in and just says, here are proposals that you can use. It's already following kind of like laws, already following the right form. Here, by the way, are speeches that you can give defending them. Here are arguments that we might think the other side might use. Here are responses that you can use for them. And this isn't just, for example, just companies directly doing this. This is oftentimes how think tanks work, where think tanks will basically do some research and they'll write up some proposal and they write up the stuff. And that is what they give through towards the party. And this is something where the policy gets shaped by the people who invest in these think tanks. And this can be like big oil companies like Shell. This can be people from the meat industry. And I think when you look at these power dynamics, I think it shows you not just from the section of who are voting for them, but also just what are the capacities inside the party? What are the things they are disagreeing about internally, but also where did they get the information from? Where did they get the resource from? It shows you in a more nuanced light and with actual context how parties are influenced by companies. And I think this is true, of course, of this farmers party where I give this context. This, of course, is also true for other parties in general. So the VVD also has, of course, a part in the body where you have investors and like company owners who need to pay a certain amount to be part of the members and like pay a certain amount to get into that position in the first place. And then they can propose policy and review policy. And again, you might say this is just sheer corruption, right? This is bad. But again, I think you can also look at it more nuancedly, where you could say, look, the matter of fact is, you can have regulation and you can have ideas of we want to deregulate. But if you don't know what the industry wants or what the specific issues are that you are walking up against, it is hard for you to create policy that's effective and also dealing with the issues. So deregulation sounds good and sounds maybe nice economically, but doing it well requires some kind of like put in from companies. And that's a way that you can defend this kind of system. You say, look, most likely there's still scrutiny within the party. They're going to look at it, not going to just take it over. There are also other parties that are in the coalition forming process who will critique these kinds of things. And there's also news media who talk about these things. There's other checks and balances that exist. But I think it's interesting to understand at least what are the actual complex mechanics of how policy gets drafted and how parties go through it. So it's important to understand there's oftentimes nuance. There are oftentimes real life examples of where it is gray, where you could say on the first sight it might look good or might look bad, but it's about the perspective you need to take in and understanding how you can defend that. Now, on that note, I think I have talked at length in this series about a lot of things. I talked about the different parties, the different crises that we've had, the different parliaments that we've had, the coalition forming, and all that kind of stuff. If there's anything you still want to see, maybe some things about the drugs policies in the Netherlands, maybe the context that we have of our ex-colonies, any other kind of stuff, just put in the comments or just send me a direct message on Facebook and I'll try to respond there to explain it. And then like I'll try to explain it there, or if there's enough interest, I'll make a video about it and I'll do that. That being said, good luck preparing for Euros, have fun, and if there are any questions, of course, put it in the comments. Good luck.